Well, welcome to the next in our series of podcasts for the Devon and Cornwall Record Society. I'm Todd Gray, and I'm very happy to welcome James Clark, who many of our members will know as a professor of history at Exeter. It's already been 10 years since he came to us. Doesn't time fly? And most people will know that he works somewhere between the Black Death and the Reformation. Now I looked this up, James. Religion, intellectual, and cultural life, but you're particularly interested in books. Books of the period, not just books today. And although you are prolific in your journal articles and your book chapter, it's your new book we're talking about today. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be here discussing this with you. So this is an account of the dissolution of the monasteries. What I would argue is quite simply the greatest drama of the Reformation in England. And strangely, in spite of its remarkable scale, its extraordinary consequences for the people of England and Wales, over recent years, it seems to have somehow been pushed to the margins of discussions of the Tudor Reformation. And perhaps even more strangely, in its place has come aspects which I think are almost something of a distraction. It seems that we've almost been in danger of reducing Henry VIII's Reformation to a kind of personal drama between himself and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, and of course, wife number two, Anne Boleyn, as if the remarkable events of the 1530s actually are played out in only the corridors of power and in the bedchamber of the king itself. And I was very keen to challenge that assumption that seems to be sort of creeping over all of us, and to make the case which previous generations would have been surprised needed to be made, really, which is that this moment in time when institutions which dominated the landscape of Tudor England were shut down suddenly, speedily, and all of the lives and livelihoods that were entangled with them also were overturned, that needs to be brought back into focus. This is very much a social history of the dissolution as opposed to a political or institutional history. As many people will know, there have been several major studies of Thomas Cromwell in recent years. There's been, among professional historians, a return to a more high political interest in Henry VIII's reign and in the Reformation. So I wanted to really turn the viewfinder the other way and to look away from those corridors of power and the bedchamber of the king, and to look across the country and to understand this episode from the point of view of the people who were caught up in it. First and foremost, the members of the different religious orders who occupied the religious houses of Tudor England and Wales, but then also the many other communities and lives and livelihoods that were tied up with them. And there were many. I think it's often overlooked that for every community of vowed religious people living in religious houses, there were 3 or 4 times as many people who were employed by them, who made their livings and often lived within the precincts of those religious houses. And then in outlying districts, there were hundreds, in some cases thousands, of people who tenanted property from them, or who were employed in some respect in land and property connected with these places. So in attempting to tear down this this fabric of medieval monastic life, the Tudor regime was actually transforming the lives of many of its subjects, and it's that that social perspective, that experience of people at ground level that I was trying to write about. Inevitably, one of the, as many people have pointed out in reviewing my book, in trying to do such a thing, it's ambitious because the scale is so great. There were more than 800 religious houses in Henry VIII's England, and therefore many people and lives connected with them. And in trying to capture something of the experience of all of them, what my book very quickly became was quite a large saga of lives and livelihoods, ranging across the country, north to south, east to west. I didn't quite set myself the challenge to mention every known religious house that was still standing in Tudor England, but at times, particularly when it came to indexing the book, it felt as if I had named pretty much every one. So it's an account of those places and the people connected with them, both on the eve of the dissolution in the 1530s, then through the experience of those years of government interference, closure, dispersal, and then it follows the story through at least to the end of Elizabeth I's reign, at the beginning of the 17th century, trying to begin to understand what some of the immediate consequences are. It would be impossible within one single volume study, I think, to do justice to the longer term consequences of the dissolution. So my book really just focuses on what those who were the generation who'd witnessed these events, what the immediate consequences were for those. So this is a book that runs from what you might say really are the end of the Middle Ages through to the beginning of the 17th century, to the eve of the Civil War. So broad in chronology as well as in content, I think.
Well, I mean, before you and before me, Joyce Ewings was the local authority here, very much in the Department of History, and somebody who worked on this 70 years ago. So, I mean, what you've done is not just updated all of the articles and the books which have happened since their time, because people will be thinking, oh, Joyce did this so many years ago. You've had to update the written, but you've also had access to documents that she wouldn't have had because a lot more has come out. So tell me a bit more about your sources.
Okay, yes. There's no doubt that Joyce Ewings did extensive and very valuable work. I think it's fair to say that her interest was in this subject area was quite particular. She was particularly interested in the dissolution as a process of the transfer of property and lordship from an institutional framework which characterized medieval economy and society to an early modern framework.
And who took it over, and she was interested in that transference of property.
Yes, and she worked, therefore, because of that particular interest, she worked particularly on the financial records that were compiled by Henry VIII's Court of Augmentations, the legal body brought into existence to manage this process of sequestration, the taking in of the properties of monasteries and then their re-transfer out to new proprietors. What I wanted to do was, as well, of course, as working on those documents, was actually to look much more extensively at the documentation that speaks of people and lives and experiences. So I think I'm probably the first person to try to piece together the patchwork of letters passing from the Crown commissioners who were responsible for the dissolution process at ground level, and the Tudor regime in Westminster and London, and Cromwell. Those letters have long been available in calendar form, so that is a printed summary transcript. And many historians, Joyce Ewing's among them, have quoted them in their calendar form. But those calendars, which were made by the original Public Record Office at the end of the 19th century, they actually were a rather sort of Bowdlerized version of the original letters. They very deliberately extracted from the original letters and often overlooked some of the most important and certainly the most interesting information contained in the letters. As you might expect of late Victorian Public Record Office archivists and clerks, they were very bashful about quoting anything that that seemed not exactly proper. So there was an awful lot of local detail and pretty colourful language that they'd simply left out of the calendars. So I was particularly concerned to make that correspondence, which runs throughout this period from the mid 1530s and on into the 1540s, to bring that back into focus. Also, there are collections of letters and papers which were never held in the Public Record Office, but were actually in private collections, and then only in the last 30, 40 years or so have passed into national collections in the British Library, in the additional manuscripts in the British Library, which is where the British Library puts more recent acquisitions. And those included papers again, and letters of commissioners for the dissolution. But because they'd never been in the PRO, they were never part of the calendar. And that enabled me to just add to this really rich body of personal correspondence, which really is, it's so much of it is so vivid. It really does take you to the heart of that lived experience. I think the other way in which I've sort of departed from previous generations is that I have tried to make this what you might call a kind of three-dimensional history of the dissolution, in that I've wanted to connect up the government documentation with what we know of individual localities, the buildings, the space, the landscape. And I think I'm quite unusual among conventional archive-based historians, that I do actually try as much as possible to embrace the work that our colleagues in archaeology do, and to integrate what we know of the process in which buildings were changed and adapted and sometimes taken down. So I've tried to weave together a picture of the process from documents, but also from the material record, from local documents that were, I think we have to be honest, they were never as well worked through by some of the more traditional historical accounts of this period. And it's really only been in the last 20 years or so, of course, that a lot of those local collections of records have become more accessible, with at least partial electronic catalogues that we can now all browse. More of it is being digitized, for example, in East Sussex, where I've taken huge advantage from the fact that that record office in that county has been progressively digitizing its late 15th and early 16th century records. So I was able to have an image of what was going on in the religious houses there that would have been very difficult and would have taken many more years to discover previously. because I can just, with a few clicks of the mouse, I can open up some digitized images. I've also tried to actually reach out to records that are still in private hands. I have been very fortunate to build up relationships with some of the families that still hold major medieval and early modern records. So I've been very grateful to the Duke of Rutland to allow me to use the archives at Belvoir Castle, which are extraordinarily rich and offer a wonderful sort of vantage point on the end of monastery institutions in the Midlands of England. The records that are now held in Devon Heritage Centre, but are still private records of the Bedfords, which are, as you know very well, a wonderful, again, snapshot of late medieval and early modern Devon. For the story of the Dissolution, they're incredibly valuable for particularly what happened at Tavistock and Buckland. The Bedford family have been very generous in allowing me to make very extensive use of those records. I also had a late sort of discovery as the book was coming to an end. A previously unnoticed copy of the Valor Ecclesiasticus, the great valuation of the church, which Henry VIII commissioned in 1535, a sort of Tudor doomsday book. A copy of that came up for auction. And again, turning in my address book to an auctioneer I've known for a number of years, I was actually able to get to the document before it was sold and went again into private hands and transcribe it. The sort of story in summary of this really in terms of the research is that it might seem surprising to many people, but new evidence is coming up all the time. If you know where to look and you're open-minded in looking anywhere and everywhere, there is still much more documentation that our predecessors as historians simply couldn't have dreamt of, didn't know about. So there's much more to discover.
Well, it's part of the art of the historian and or the researcher and being open to ideas and open to different ways of looking at things. But your reach is much greater than, I mean, partly because you allow it to be, to be blunt, it's not closing yourself off to information. So you've got all this material. What are a few of the surprises when you actually started to pull it together? I mean, what did you look at and think, oh, blimey, look at that?
I think the staggering clumsiness of the Tudor regime was the standout discovery for me. Like any student of history, I think, of my generation, I'd been reared on the image of the Tudor regime as almost ahead of its time in its remarkable efficiency, in its mobilization of a almost ruthless machinery of government, which rolled out across England and Wales, stripping it of its sort of medieval informality and making it into an early modern state ahead of most of the rest of Europe. And that assumption, I mean, at one brief stage in my undergraduate career, I was actually taught by Geoffrey Elton. So it's not surprising that I had that image of Tudor government. I remember asking Geoffrey Elton about the essence of Tudor government, and he came back straight away, simply saying, "What you simply need to look at the records of the Exchequer and the all of those draft statutes. That this is a government that is so clear in its ambition and competent in its tools, that there's almost nothing it can do, it can't do. And that was absolutely Elton's view to the very end, I think. What I found was completely inverted that image. I found time and again letters from the King's commissioners back to Thomas Cromwell in his offices in Austin Friars in the City of London, saying, it's been weeks now, we still haven't received any clear instructions from you. What are we supposed to do? Letters from Richard Rich, who I must admit, one of my discoveries has been a great liking for Richard Rich, who was Chancellor of the Court of Augmentations, because I sort of, as somebody who's been employed in universities for 25 years, his sheer frustration at central authority not making its plans entirely clear, I can understand something of what frustration he must have felt when he seems enraged by hierarchies that are very powerful but not always very explicable in their behavior. Everyone involved, from Richard Rich downwards, involved in trying to make the dissolution a reality, never has enough information as to what is going on, what they are supposed to be doing. And that was a complete revelation. The at times organized chaos that the dissolution amounted to was fascinating to find. I think the other discovery, which again dispelled, for me certainly, assumptions that I had coming into the subject, was that to most onlookers, the end of the dissolution process by the Easter of 1540 actually would have seemed almost a lot of sound and fury, but signifying very little indeed, because outwardly very little had changed. What the dissolution didn't mean in the 1540s or the 1550s or 60s or 70s even, was the toppling of much of the fabric of monastic England. The buildings remained. They were mothballed, as it were. They were closed, locked up, chained up, but they weren't taken down. They weren't all unroofed. I discovered that, you mentioned my interest in medieval books. I discovered that many libraries see their books simply still standing in their book presses. They haven't been removed. They're still there. Quite a lot of the other fixtures and furnishings are still there. I found that the Crown's inability to administer between the centre of government and these dispersed provincial centres mean that even those pieces of the fabric of monasteries that have the most commercial value, like lead, timber, stone, building materials that could be recycled, it's very difficult for the Crown to actually manage that process. So at the end of Mary's reign, so 20 years after the dissolution process itself, the end of Mary's reign, quantities of lead are still standing on the quayside in major ports such as Bristol, and surveyors go and look at them and find that yes, indeed, they're stamped with the Crown's insignia, and they've been waiting there for the best part of 20 years. The Crown can't actually afford to move the lead, and so it tries to farm out the right for the carriage of lead. But understandably, even the most ambitious entrepreneur isn't very keen on taking on that business. It's very expensive to move lead inland across the country, close and to get it near to a port where it could be carried by ships. So the sort of the demonasticizing of Tudor England, the taking down of this infrastructure that had been there for centuries, just doesn't happen. So I think that those are the discoveries, that a different image of Tudor government, not always ruthlessly efficient, where communication was poor, where even those relatively close to the center of power, like Richard Rich, hadn't a clue what was going on much of the time, and where nothing outwardly changes very quickly. The biggest change that comes in 1540 is that 10 or 12,000 people who used to live under religious vows are now living outside, and they're no longer living under vows, and they are displaced people. But the buildings, the sites, the furnishings, many of them are still standing where they were, and they remain like that for years to come.
I mean, if I can add one other question, which we haven't been doing, but when I came to England as an undergraduate, when I was a teenager in London, I was surprised Edward Good, Mary Bad, Elizabeth Better, you know, Reformation, Dissolution, instruments of progress, Catholicism, almost evil. And you know, I was stunned by how this ran through all the historiography, and you know, there were no voices that I could see as a 18-year-old challenging this. Do you think that prejudice is still there?
Oh, I do, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting question, and I have to say, coming to this as a secular historian myself, it's always fascinated me that in a society such as Britain is today, which is almost avowedly secular in outlook, and yet still the old Anglican versus Catholic axis is not very far below the surface. And I say this in many of the talks that I give, that I know I'm facing an audience much of the time who probably haven't gone inside a church or wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as practicing Anglicans. You know, we're long past the point at which most people in this country would have identified in such a way, and yet the old Anglicanism good, a modernizing force, Catholicism bad remains. And as I've said, I must admit in some of the things that I've published on this, the clearest and most widely known example of that is surely Hilary Mantel's trilogy, where my main challenge to that series of books is that it does nothing to unpick that old caricature that the Catholic forces are in some way insidious, reactionary, obstacles to almost to human progress and enlightenment, as it were, and that the new religion is the force that will carry England into a more modern, progressive, enlightened, liberal future. And it's remarkable to me, if we were still, you know, like many parts of the US, for example, if we were still a deeply confessionalized society where many people still practiced religion and regularly attended a church of some kind, it would be more explicable. What I find so odd is that we carry this forward, even though we've stripped away most of the sort of Anglican culture that my grandparents and great-grandparents would have known. You know, post-war and 21st century Britain are not predominantly confessionalized Anglican in outlook, and yet something that would have been familiar to the sort of church-state outlook at the end of the 19th century, we still have with us. And we have to do everything we can to challenge that, not just because it's a utter distortion of how we should understand our Reformation history, but I think it is important to detach what the Tudor regime was doing from those old partisan positions, and that's why I have to say I felt that the Wolf Hall trilogy in a sense, did a fair amount of damage, because it actually returned us to those old partisan positions.
It's created a good story.
Yeah, and that's fine for a stage play, for Man for All Seasons or Anna of 1,000 Days. That's absolutely fine. But at a time when more people will get their history, not from a book like mine, to be honest, but from novelized versions, then it is more problematic. And I think we need to move away from this partisan view, as you say. I mean, it reduces it almost to an old-fashioned 1950s Western, where the bad guys wear the black hats and the good guys wear the white hats. It's simply, arguably, it's so much more interesting than that. What's going on in 1530s and 1540s England is not a great ideological battle, but actually something that takes us much more, I think, to the heart, the essence of what is at the heart of sort of English experience and identity. It's much more about community and locality and what institutions and the livelihoods associated with them meant often only in a local context. People responded to these changes pragmatically, more often than not ideologically. And I think we do a disservice to our Tudor ancestors if we want to try and press them into this kind of ideological and partisan framework. It's simply not like that.
Well, I hope people will keep this in mind when they read your book. I mean, it's a bit like the debate on The Crown. You know, what's more important, a good story or historical evidence? Or looking at the Reformation as the Brexit of their time, of this great fundamental change, and the role of opinion rather than fact, or emotion rather than logic. You know, all these issues that, you know, we've lived through, we can apply to the past. But now the name of your book is?
So it's The Dissolution of the Monasteries, A New History.
And the paperback version comes out fairly soon.
So the paperback version comes out in early November, and will be available in any bookstore and of course online.
Great. Well, thank you, James, for giving up your time. I was only going to keep you for 10 minutes, but I'm glad you've had time to talk longer, because it's even more fascinating. But it's a wonderful topic, and I know you've done well with it, because I have read sections of the book. Haven't finished it all, but I've read sections. And it's a worthy addition. So, you know, for anybody interested in Devon and Cornwall, it's getting that picture and understanding that it isn't about the evidence, it's about how we view it. And this is one of those aspects of history which we will never be finished with, because it's such an enormous thing. It's like the empire happening and disappearing. You know, these things happen without us understanding the import of them. But thank you ever so much, James.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Right, thank you. And now I'm going to turn off our recording.